We'll just wing it.
Yeah.
Warm greetings to all of you who are joining us for what episode is it? No, ninth episode. For the ninth episode of The Third Way, live with the SG. And of course, as always, special and particular greetings to the ones joining us particularly early in the morning, probably in Latin America and the Caribbean. And of course, those who are up quite late, most likely in Asia Pacific, in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, who are joining us at ungodly hours in order to partake in those sessions. And of course, as always, these sessions for the Third Way, live with the SG, are designed, as you are all aware, I hope by now, not for me to pontificate as Secretary General, but to provide a platform so that we may hear your voice, hear your questions, your critiques, hear as well your proposals with regards to the collective construction of a third way of development. And to do so, of course, in a manner that is more direct, without filters, than what usually occurs through usual communication on social media that tends to be very unidirectional. And of course, all of the viewers should be aware by now that you can ask your questions, issue your critiques by placing a comment on one of the social media platforms. And I understand that today we have a slight technical issue with the WhatsApp function. Therefore, it will still be live, but unfortunately the voice function will not be working. But you can still write to us there and it will reach me without filters. Now, of course, speaking of communications, as you're all aware, there's always this period before I open the floor where I mention a few matters that are on my mind as Secretary General within the context of our collective endeavors from the Greater South, by the Greater South, but indeed for the entirety of humanity, of building this third way of development. And of course, as you are all aware, in about exactly a week's time, a week plus 1 day, so 8 days, it would appear, if my math is correct. I was never quite good at it. But I believe that 7 plus 1 means 8. But of course, we have the General Assembly. And as we're getting closer to the General Assembly, which is our main decision-making body, the supreme entity within the Organization of Southern Cooperation, bringing together our member states and our associate members to discuss the common program that we presented last week, at least my proposal to the General Assembly for the common program, of consideration of this common program and its adoption for the next 2 years, as well as a wide array of issues that are of extreme strategic importance for the organization. And of course, since the General Assembly is so very near, we are all around here running around the clock with very little sleep. And therefore my endeavor will be to make this episode slightly more concise than usual, not by shortening the time given to answering your questions and comments, but in making my own intervention much shorter. But before getting there, I must still say a few words. Because I was mentioning that the third way, Live with ESG, is meant to be a more interactive platform. A platform of genuine, authentic engagement within the limitations of virtuality with every single one of you. Because this endeavor that is ours can only be achieved by everyone's participation. In that this platform is, therefore, less unidirectional than social media communications that you usually see, which tend to be entirely unidirectional. And therefore, I would like to discuss very, very briefly the matter of communication to reach to a more profound issue that I think we need to collectively reflect upon if we are to achieve this collective construction. And this really stems out of a comment I received last week, not by one of the participants to the third way, but a good friend of mine, who was mentioning to me that perhaps in order to achieve greater viewership of the third way, Live with ESG, that it might be important, and of course that was said with the best of intentions, it might be important to to start collecting data of the viewership, starting to analyze that data and identify what are the major points that generate interest, and from there to start focusing each episode on these segments. And of course, I appreciated the comment and the care, but that raised two considerations in my mind. The first is that here at the OSC, during these sessions, we're not particularly tied to the idea that the most important factor is just numbers. Mind you, I am not saying, far from it, that viewership or the total number of associate members, the total number of member states are not important aspects. Of course they are. There is a strength to be found in numbers. But what we firmly believe here at the OSC is that aside from numbers, what matters is engagement. What matters is commitment. And one individual with unwavering commitment, one individual entirely involved and engaged within this collective process is worth, at least to me, 1,000 occasional viewers that are not involved in this collective construction. Because the point of these sessions is not to hear me speak. The point of these sessions is not to just understand better the organization of Southern cooperation. It is to enter into a genuine dialogue where you become, because you are the protagonists of our endeavors. And therefore, if we are 300, or if we are 10, or if we are 2,000, when equipped with that unwavering commitment, that is far more valuable than any data statistics or popularity that may emerge from viral videos, which leads me to the second dimension. Because the suggestion was ultimately, to increase viewership, but to do so from the starting point of analyzing data, seeing what is popular, and focusing on replicating what is popular. And that reminded me an extraordinary book by Régis Debray. It was published in The French Philosopher. It was published in 2017, if my memory doesn't fail me. It's called Civilisation, comment sommes-nous devenus américains? Civilization, how have we become, or how have we all become Americans? And of course, this book is an extraordinary book. I can't vouch for the English translation, having read it in French, but I highly advise reading it, because its substance, its content is extraordinary. There's very, very few books that I've read over the past 5 or so years that have left such a mark on my way of perceiving the world. But in any event, I will focus on the one item that is relevant to what I was mentioning, which is, he made an argument, fundamentally, that the United States, whether or not that is true, that is not the point of today's discussion, but that the United States, of course he was speaking from the perspective of Europe, and especially France. He said, the realm of Europe, the realm of France, was the realm of memory, the realm of heritage that you received from ancestors, upon which you built and which you transmitted. Whereas the realm of the United States, being as a country much newer, much more recent in history, and one that had an expansionist policy to create its own territory from 13 colonies to what we know today as the United States. And that therefore the realm of the United States was more space, less time. And he goes on building upon this argument and says, because he was of course lamenting in many respects this decline of Europe that has become itself American in his view, but he says at one point, the know-how of communicating well has taken the place of the art of transmitting well. And I appreciate the idea that this might sound a bit abstract. But ultimately, come to think of it, building upon what that person was saying last week, come to think of it, if we are building a project for the world, if we are endeavoring to transform our world, then what we need above all is to transmit the essence of that project. What we need to be able to do is to transmit the ideas, the sentiments, the principles, the convictions that animate all of us. And knowing as well that these convictions, these principles, did not stem out of nothing, that we are the heirs, whether we realize it or not, of decades, if not centuries, of endeavors. What Newton would have called, to quote or paraphrase Newton, if I have seen farther than others, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants. Yet, at one point, there seems to be we seem to have undergone this shift. Without wanting to criticize our communicators here at the OSC, who are present here at the Office of Public Advocacy, Communications and Engagement, it's a more societal issue. There was a time before that shift of which I've spoken in the past, which I place in the 90s, with the triumphant march of a new world order that delegitimized dreams and therefore declared the supremacy of technocracy. Well, in that same moment, we went from societies that when articulating collective projects, whether at the national level or at the regional level or for the world, we went from endeavors that sought to transmit in all its complexity, all its nuances, the essence of the message. And then we used to leave it to the communication experts to translate this into, say, for example, a slogan, or a poster, or an image, or an illustration in the paper. And yet, since the 90s, a shift has happened that is similar to the shift from collective dreams supported by technocracy to technocracy overtaking the place of dreams. Of us first trying to find what is it that can be communicated well, before asking ourselves, what is it that we truly want to transmit? And you see this where our leaders used to be surrounded by intellectuals, by academics, by philosophers, by social activists, by syndicate leaders. And today, and when I say our leaders, not just political, our leaders even within organizations, the number one office next to the office of the leader of an organization or a country tends to be the communication office. And no longer the intellectuals are used to transmit that substance, these ideas, and then we would worry about how to communicate it. And therefore I find a very worrisome trend. And this is a trend that cannot be part of our endeavors for a third way of development. And that worrisome trend is we try to think of the slogan before we even had the idea of what we wanted to do. That is, we used to think and articulate a collective project, and then we used to find a slogan for it. And today it appears that we have started to think in slogans. And when we prod and we go in depth, there is no substance, only the slogan. And of course, this is why, on the one hand, I am not going to engage, at least for those sessions that are meant to be more informal, less structured, less heavy in procedure, and more open. I will not engage in data analysis to find what is the most popular segment of the Third Way Live with the SG. I will say what I have to say. You may like it or dislike it, but this is why it is interactive. Let me know what it is that you liked, what you would like us to develop. Tell me what it is that you disliked and challenge me on it. And from there, in this dialogue, in this communion, it is that we can build the world that we want. Because the world that we want will not be decreed by me, and it will certainly not be decreed in a tweet that goes viral. The world that we want is going to emerge from authentic dialogue, sometimes contradictory, but always fruitful. In the heat of the exchange, there is the spark that can set our course towards a better world alight. But of course, even though I wasn't planning to speak about this, since I raised Régis Debray, who mentioned, whose book was Civilization, How Have We All Become American? And because I was mentioning the fact that we are no longer as leaders, and I include myself in this, even though I try to challenge this on my day-to-day, surrounded by intellectuals, but rather, well, I don't mean it as a slight to any of you from our PACE team, not at all. But in addition to the communications people, we should have the intellectuals, etc., in that we are no longer. So there's two issues there. The US, that I mentioned, through Régis Debray's book, and the fact that we are no longer surrounded by the intellectuals that provide substance to our endeavors. Collectively, not at the OSCE, I mean across the world. And this leads me to a topic that is the election that happened in the United States, on the 5th of November. And far from me, mind you, I am not interested in the least on debating Democrat versus Republican or Trump versus Kamala Harris. Far from me. I don't think that it is of interest for me to mention it, in part because this is a topic that has been discussed time and time again, and we are probably all of us tired of reading any kind or hearing any kind of analysis, whether pro or con any result. But rather what I'd like to mention is that the election in the United States was perhaps evidence of something that I alluded to in the past, in one of the episodes. That there are now two Norths. There is, of course, the North that we're all used to, the government of the United States, the governments in Europe, the government of Canada, the government of New Zealand, and so on and so forth. But there is a new North. And that new North is a North that is far less transparent, and therefore far less accountable. And that is the North of large multinational corporations that are, in effect, at times even more powerful than governments. But as opposed to governments, they do not have to be accountable to anyone. A government, the government of the United States, is accountable to the American people. A private company is only accountable to its shareholders. That is it. It is not accountable to the general public. And the reason I say this is, of course, we've seen the emergence, in the words of President-elect Trump, whom we congratulate on his election, a new star, who mentioned that a new star is born, Elon Musk. And whereas I do not know Elon Musk as a person, I have no judgment on him as a person, and it does not interest me to debate Elon Musk as a person. But it is more interestingly the structural elements that make that you have an Elon Musk today who is someone, a single human being that was able to undertake a transaction to purchase Twitter that has become X at $44 billion. One single transaction, which is more than the nominal GDP value, not to take a country of the South, a country in Europe, that is more than the GDP value of Estonia. It is almost, to take a country in the South, the nominal GDP value of Jordan. It is an individual who owns a company, SpaceX, and of course, we are all full of admiration for the innovations of SpaceX that are extraordinary. But that through SpaceX owns 62% of all satellites in orbit around the world. 62% are owned by a private company. A single private company. And of course, during the US elections, we also saw the role that such companies or such individuals, when the structural mechanisms allow, can play in this realm. And why am I raising this? Not because, again, I want to mention Elon Musk, but because I believe that as part of a third way of development, we must debate thoroughly the concentration of power. Whether that concentration of power is within the continent of Europe, whether that concentration of power is within a private company, which is not accountable to anyone, or indeed if that concentration of power is in the south within our capital cities. But overall, in mentioning this concentration of power in private companies, we have entered uncharted territory. Never in the history of humankind had one individual or a handful of individuals held so much power. And again, it is not a judgment of those individuals. They might be extraordinary human beings. But just as I have term limits as Secretary General, because no matter how extraordinary I may be, we do not want to have a situation where a Secretary General becomes or has the possibility or the option of misusing his office. The same should be true with these large corporations. And since we have entered an uncharted territory, to go back to what I was saying of our focus on communication rather than transmission, on the social media advisor instead of the intellectual, I do believe, and you are all aware by now, that I am a firm believer that now is the time for action. However, as Imam al-Ghazali said in a letter to one of his disciples, it's known in Arabic as Ayyuha al-Walid. And in this letter, so one of his disciples heard, I think that it was in the 11th, 12th century, heard that Imam al-Ghazali was passing away and wrote to him saying, please write to me in a concise sense all of your wisdom before you pass away. So Imam al-Ghazali writes back this letter that we still have, and he says, أيها الولد العلم بلا عمل جنون. O disciple, O child, knowledge without action is pure madness, insanity. Hence why we firmly believe at the OSC that we must have action. But he continues on. والعلم والعمل بلا علم لا يكون. And action or work without knowledge cannot be. And I believe that since we have entered in this uncharted territory, even though we must remain determined to deliver very concretely on the aspirations of our peoples, of not remaining an abstract endeavor, I also believe that the development of the world, such as a single company owning 62% of all satellites in orbit today, 62%. That we must fundamentally recognize that the developments of the world are going much faster than our ideas and interpretive frameworks, go much further than our frameworks of analysis that we have inherited. And I fundamentally believe, and this is a message to our universities, this is a message to our intellectuals, now is the time as well, in parallel to the action that we at the OSC are determined to deliver, now is the time as well for theoretical work, rethinking our theoretical frameworks for a new world. We cannot build the new world with the frameworks of the old. And this is why we are convening, and this is where I will conclude, the ConGreS of the Greater South, that has already started through a number of consultations and will culminate in 2026, precisely so that we may all come together as countries, of course, as civil society organizations, as intellectuals, and as universities, to reflect not only on the actions we need to take, but also, and again this is a message for our intellectuals and universities, on the interpretive frameworks, on the epistemologies that we need to develop from the Greater South to enable us to build the new. In any event, I promised that I would be short. I was not, and I know I was slightly rambling. Nevertheless, these were general thoughts in knowledge that these episodes are not meant to be as polished, thank you, as other interventions that I may have. So we now open the floor. I will look at the questions that we have received. So I see a question from Saleh, who is from Ethiopia but based in Germany. And it is a question that was sent on WhatsApp. He says, first, let me apologize for missing the previous sessions due to overlapping commitments. However, I had the chance to listen to parts of the earlier discussions, and I found them incredibly thought-provoking and engaging. My question might seem a bit basic, but I wanted to focus on the title of your OSC plan, The Third Way. It struck me that framing it as the third way might imply a singular alternative, potentially limiting the scope of possibilities. Why not consider something like the other ways, which could suggest a plurality of approaches and open up the conversation to multiple pathways? Or is the intention here to define these other ways specifically as the third way? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you very much, Saleh, for this crucial question. Allow me to answer you on multiple fronts. First, the very institutional front. Then, on the more substantive front. On the institutional front, of course, the OSC and the Secretariat and I use the third way of development because it is, crucially, in our Constitutive Charter and the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education. But now, of course, the question is, why is it in the Constitutive Charter? And that leads me actually, before the substantive, to the second layer. And the second layer is, of course, that the third way should be understood more precisely as the common idiomatic usage of third way. It doesn't literally mean, in fact, that there is a first way, a second way, and this is the third way, for instance, in terms of rankings or in terms of emergence. But rather it just seeks to articulate by third way idiomatically that it is alternative. Now, this is purely grammatical, or idiomatic rather. What is more important is the substance. And I fully concur with you, not about the naming, but about the essence. That is, and I've said this in the past and I ratify it now, a third way of development cannot, should not, will not mean a third model that is standardized, universal, to be applied in every country in the same manner. No. A third way must imply within its essence a multiplicity of forms, a multiplicity, a diversity of models depending on national priorities, local realities, and the preferences and sensibilities, cultural and social, of each society. However, we speak of a third way rather than ways, as you suggest, for a very simple reason. Whilst this third way must imply a diversity of models, a multiplicity of forms, a plurality at its essence, we nonetheless believe that we are all aiming towards the same destination. That is, we are building a collective, and that requires understanding from our perspective, I believe, that in having this plurality, in having this diversity, in having this multiplicity of models and forms, we nonetheless need to agree on a certain set of common principles that can be translated very differently depending on national priorities. I'll give you a very concrete example. It is my belief, however, ultimately, it is the countries and the civil society organizations that will partake in the Summit of the Greater Self as part of the ConGreS of the Greater Self who will take a final view to articulate this common definition and common roadmap towards a third way of development. But it is my view that a third way of development must inevitably include as part of its principles endogenous development. Endogenous development purely meaning development based upon our own endogenous capacities, our own endogenous resources. And of course, when speaking of an endogenous way or endogenous development, what this ultimately also entails is that if you are, for instance, a right-wing government, or let's start with the left-wing government. You're a left-wing government that has, for instance, critical minerals that are essential for renewable technology, such as solar panels or for lithium batteries. And currently you are exporting raw material, the raw minerals. And as part of adopting this principle of endogenous development and high value added development, you decide that going forward, your country should no longer export raw material, raw critical minerals, but should transform those minerals into solar panels or lithium batteries before being exported. As a left-wing government, you could say, well, I do not trust the private sector, and therefore we are going to establish a state-owned enterprise, a public company, in order to process those minerals into solar panels or lithium batteries. Well, that is endogenous development and high value added industrializations. I take no view on whether a state-owned enterprise or not is good. That is, you developed your own model, which is based upon a state-owned enterprise, but you are still within the principle of endogenous development. Other end of the political spectrum, let's say you're a right-wing government in the same circumstance. You might say, I do not believe in government intervention into the economy through state-owned enterprises. And you might say, well, what I will do as a right-wing government is I will put in certain policies, certain tax incentives to ensure that a private company, but that is national, that is from a national of the country rather than a foreign company, will process those critical minerals in order for them to become, rather than raw exports, solar panel exports or lithium battery exports. Again, wildly different form of implementing the same principle. But it is still the implementation of the same principle on the basis of different models. And therefore, when we speak of a third way of development, it is because even though we have different forms, different models of implementing this third way, of building this third way of development, we are united in the same direction by adopting some common principles that lead us towards a transformation of our world on a more just and equitable basis. I hope I've answered your question. If I haven't, feel free to challenge me or ask me a follow-up, and I will be happy to do so. So, let us, because I see there's a few on WhatsApp, but let's see a few of the questions on the other social media. We'll get back to the WhatsApp ones. So we have a question from Scott saying, taking your introduction, what do you think about the monopoly of media and how some governments in the South are monopolizing all media and they don't allow the free speech of the people? Well, that is a very good question, Scott, but it is also one I'd like to challenge in terms of the underlying premise. That is, of course, needless to say, we are all in favor of people expressing themselves freely, so long as it is respectful, so long as it is not inciting hatred, and so on and so forth. So, there is no need for us to rehash and restate and develop upon what we all already agree. However, the underlying premise of your question is, of course, countries of the South and governments of the South, bad; countries of the North, governments of the North, media of the North, absolutely free. And what I would like to argue, because I think this is very important, is if your principle, Scott, is that you should have free speech without censorship, then we also have to enter into some nuance in terms of that debate about censorship. And what I mean by nuance is the underlying premise of the question that you're posing is that there is censorship in the South, which again is very, very broad, because the South is extremely diverse. I assure you, you go to Argentina, and there is no government censorship of the media, at least not officially. I assure you, you go to Lebanon, there is no government censorship of the media. In fact, the media spends its time criticizing the government. So I would like us to first understand that the global South, or the greater South as we call it, is extremely diverse. And there is no way for me to say that, well, in the South there is censorship of the media, in the North, as opposed to the North. The South is diverse when it comes to the media. The South is extremely diverse when it comes to free speech and free media, freedom of the press. But, let me ask you something, Scott. Do you consider, and this is an actual question, feel free to put a comment, and I'll be happy to build upon it. But do you believe that when you go in France and all the major newspapers and media channels are owned by 4 or 5 billionaires? Or when you go to the US, and it is quite similar. And the latest example, well, don't you believe that there is as well a concern of censorship from these very powerful interests that control these papers? And we had a very recent good example of the owners interfering into the editorial choices when the Washington Post decided for the first time in I don't know how many decades not to endorse a candidate by choice of its owner. And I'm not saying the owner doesn't have the right to do so, to interfere within it. But ultimately, I do believe that you have an equally concerning censorship that happened in the North, but that is less visible by billionaire owners of those same papers. Now, having challenged a bit of your premise, I will answer a question that you did not ask. What is my ideal format? My ideal format would be that we establish public media which is not the same as government-controlled media. Public media funded by public money, but with autonomy laws, so that the government cannot interfere in its editorial choices. If our concern, Scott, is censorship or bias, then most likely we have to be fair and not just point fingers at governments in the South, but also point fingers at private ownership that also has biases because it has powerful interests. So perhaps we can agree that the best answer to your question is let's work towards establishing public media with autonomy laws that are not funded by billionaires nor funded by ads. I hope I've overall answered your question. Feel free to challenge me or ask a follow-up. Scott, I see you have another question. And this one, I don't want to challenge the premise, even though I will, well, you know me, Scott. This is the second time I challenge your premises. We have to keep up tradition. But you're asking, on action, is the OSC matching its program with SDG of UN, or you have others? Well, yes and no. Yes and no in the sense that, of course, everything that we are doing at the OSC contribute ultimately to the SDGs and their realization. However, I would argue that almost anything that you would do, anything that you would do would actually contribute to the SDGs if you're in the development sector, because they are so very broad. I'll give you a very concrete example. SDG 4, Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is about education, which in sum says that by 2030, we will ensure inclusive, equitable, and quality education for all. Beautiful. We all agree. The question is, what does quality mean? What does inclusivity mean? What does equity mean? And what I've seen too often is, ever since the SDGs were adopted, is SDG washing. And what I mean by SDG washing is you see everybody articulating all of their actions around the SDGs to justify what they've been doing for the past 20 years. That is, before the SDGs were adopted. Why? Because they are far too broad. And so, of course, we are in favor of the realization of the SDGs. But that is the yes part of my answer. But the no part is the OSCE is going a step further by having, through our member states and associate members, articulated some very clear objectives in our strategic plan, articulated very clear aspirations and commitments within the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education, and very clear objectives and goals that are less global, even though they still cover 3 continents, towards within our common program. And therefore, when the OSCE speaks of education, we don't just speak of quality, inclusive, and equitable education. No, we speak of balanced and inclusive education, which we believe responds to equity, quality, and inclusiveness, but takes the definition further by defining very precisely what we mean in terms of the educational transformation to which we aspire. So this is my answer to you. So yes and no. Yes, we contribute to the SDGs, of course, but we believe that aside from these very generic and global goals, you need to have more precise, detailed, specific, and context-related goals, which we from the OSCE are serving as well as per the foundational documents of our organization. I hope I've answered your question. Feel free to challenge. I see a question or comment, I don't know, from Isaias Chemeda, Wata founder from Ethiopia, who says, suggestion. To address SpaceX's dominance, which accounts for 62% of orbiting satellites, fostering the growth of private aerospace companies worldwide, can introduce healthy competition, encouraging innovation and supporting new entrants in the satellite and space industry can help diversify the sector, ensuring a more balanced presence in orbit. Moreover, having multiple tech companies capable of rapid deployment of technologies such as satellites is crucial for addressing emergencies. For instance, during the early stages of the Russia-Ukraine war, SpaceX, under Elon Musk's leadership, deployed 47 Starlink satellites to restore Ukraine's communication infrastructure after Russia disrupted it. This example highlights the significance of accessible, responsive tech companies in solving global challenges, from communication blackouts to disaster recovery. So this is a suggestion and proposal, which I'm very glad you made. I'm very grateful for it. And I think there's 2 things I would like to build upon with your suggestion. On the one hand, yes, I firmly believe in the importance for our countries, and this is a crucial part of the OSCE's work, of our countries fostering homegrown endogenous technologies in all fields, from startups at the local level to indeed the space industry. And therefore, we at the OSCE are working extensively with the member states, including some initiatives that are open directly to our technology companies, such as the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technologies. But we work extensively with our member states in order to, 1, provide them support in articulating the necessary policies, the necessary juridical frameworks that are conducive to the development of endogenous or homegrown technologies, whilst also having a role to play in pooling the resources of our countries together to provide our technological companies with economies of scale, which they need in order to create healthy competition. So I fully concur with you on this front, that we need to foster greater innovation within our countries in order to generate the necessary competition that is healthy. But on the other end of the spectrum, I do think that there is a major concern when it comes to, and in fact, the example that you mentioned is a good one, that during the early days of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Elon Musk quickly deployed Starlink satellites in order to support Ukraine. I am not saying it was a bad idea. I am not taking a position. But the concern is that a private company can decide when to provide satellites for an entire country to have access to the internet is highly worrisome. So in this case, one can assume it was a positive contribution to Ukraine. But it could also be the other way around. If Starlink, a private company's satellites, can be provided at the initiative of a private company to an entire country, it can also be removed by a private company at the initiative, the sole initiative of that private company. So as much as the private company can provide internet to a whole country, it can also generate a blackout for an entire country. And that is a very worrisome power dynamic. Remember that we do not create laws in order we create laws in order to avoid the worst case scenario, even if it's unlikely. That is, the law bases itself upon the worst case scenario and tries to prevent it. And therefore I would say, yes, we need to foster innovation within our countries, including in satellite building and in the space industry. But we also need, I think, at the multilateral level, and that is what I meant by saying our frameworks of old are no longer applicable to today. We need, I believe, a new multilateral convention setting out some regulations and rules, especially when it comes to space and the use of those technologies by private companies to regulate and mitigate potential disastrous consequences that nobody intended. I hope I've complimented your suggestion. Feel free to challenge me if needs be. Then, I see a question that was sent on WhatsApp by Anonymous that says, which I suppose will be the last one because we have to conclude, is, Dear Secretary General, thank you for your wonderful live streams. I have heard you many times talking about humanity in many of your speeches. Besides the normal definition we all know, human beings collectively, what is humanity to you? What is the humanity that you and the OSCE work for? Please explain the concept from the South by the South for humanity. I think this is a very profound question that is very difficult to answer in a concise manner. I think this is something that could even justify or warrant an entire book. Because any definition, Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching mentions as the first sentence about the Tao, or the way, but the best editions don't actually translate. They said the Tao. The Tao that is spoken is not the Tao. Very profound concept. but that is any definition that is finite seems at the very end of the day to be too limiting to fully express the entirety of the extent of it. Now, of course, there is that objective definition, human beings collectively, that you refer to. But I agree, when I mention humanity, I do it in a different context. Of course, human beings collectively, but not only. I think that humanity, and please don't hold me to it, because I am defining it as I'm speaking. I think that humanity, I'm speaking about humanity, pal, don't tell me 15 minutes. That humanity, I suppose, I think that humanity is memory. But not only. But let me elaborate on memory. It is all this collective knowledge, but also the spirit that has been transmitted from generation to generation to generation. This immaterial aspect of memory. But a memory that is not just individual, but is collective. I was saying earlier, if we see farther than others, it is because we stood on the shoulders of giants. So humanity has a dimension of memory, of collective memory, that makes it so that I feel pain about massacres that occurred before I was born. I feel it because it is part of my memory, my collective memory that was passed to me. But it is also this smallholder farmer who cultivates coffee and knows which leaf or which branch must be cut off, not just because they're an expert and they studied it, but because it was their father or their mother that taught them, and their parents that taught them. But memory is not enough, because humanity is not just, I suppose, a history book. It's also, humanity is an aspiration, a gasp of breath towards the future, towards a dream. It is, I have the memory of all those that have preceded me, both by blood or not. But I also have, from there, from these roots, that aspiration for a different tomorrow. An authentic future, not just a tomorrow in the sense of waking up and following the routine, but a tomorrow that is transgenerational, that is just as I have received a memory, it is me knowing that I will, directly or indirectly, transmit a memory as well, that will not be identical to the one I received. And the one that I want to transmit, I want to transmit better. But I suppose humanity as well is relations, it's sentiments. What I mean by this is I see humanity in those small acts of solidarity. I see humanity in those acts of selfless sacrifice. I see humanity in its entirety, held within a single moment when a mother decides, because she cannot afford to both purchase lunch for herself and a snack for her kid, decides to buy the snack for her kid. It's unfair, it's unjust, but she selflessly sacrifices for her child. The entirety of humanity is contained within that moment. You know, there's this poem by William Blake called Auguries of Innocence, where he says, "To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." And I think that's the paradox in why I'm finding it difficult to define humanity just this way, which is to write the entirety of the history and the aspirations and the dreams of humanity would be impossible to contain in all the pages of the world, and we wouldn't have enough servers to contain it digitally either. But at the same time, the entirety of humanity can be contained within that single tiny moment. Humanity is justice. It's love at the risk of sounding foolish. Humanity is righteous anger at injustice, righteous anger at unfairness. Humanity is the past, the memory, but it's also the future, the aspiration. And humanity is what we make of it. We forge it, we shape it, each one of us. And it has a strength that is beyond that of individuals. When you take a macro view of history, individuals can be horrible sometimes. But when you take a macro view of history, it does tend to bend towards the arc of justice, of greater care. So what is humanity? It's what you, each one of you, every day can forge through abnegation, sacrifice. Because you're entirely aware that this transcends every single one of us. That humanity is bigger than every single one of us. I hope I've answered you somehow. But in any event, I think this is a good note to conclude an episode that was not very structured, but that conveyed honest sentiments. And as we will meet next week from the General Assembly Hall, I believe, because it will be the Sunday before the General Assembly opens. I thank you all for your comments. I thank you all for your questions. If I have missed any, I will try to address them in the next episode at the very start, next Sunday. But since we're meeting next Sunday right before the GA, remember the poem I keep quoting at the end of each episode from Mario Benedetti. Y hay quienes se desmueren y hay quienes se desviven. y así entre todos logran lo que era un imposible, que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. And there are those who die and those who live doing their utmost in this endeavor. And this way, between all of them, they achieve what was once thought to be an impossible. That the entirety of the world may know that the South also exists.